Like a bright star from a fallen heaven, Dooku stepped out of the light and shook hands with the shadow. Following the death of his beloved friend, he struck a deal which bargained his soul for what he thought would be the security of the galaxy. This is a story that we've all become very familiar with, but what is less familiar to us is what happened between the points of 22 BBY when Dooku emerged as Darth Tyranus and when he began his Sith tutelage. Greetings lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. In Legends, there are 10 years of total silence which comprises Dooku's entire training under Darth Sidious. We have details on the formation of almost every major Sith apprentice except for Darth Tyranus, which we find to be most curious. So in today's holocron, we aim to discuss everything there is to know about Dooku's seminal years as a Sith Lord. We want to find out where and how Sidious trained him, how his training differed drastically from that of Darth Maul, and how it made him into a Sith Lord of the future, and how Dooku's training represented the evolution of the Sith way. But in the spirit of Dooku's very expensive training under Sidious, we've officially relaunched our Star Wars merch page for the holiday season. The site is running a massive sale up to 30% off across the entire catalog, and because Dooku believed in refining every advantage, you can stack your own if you use code WAVE, W-A-V-E at checkout for an additional 15% off your entire order. Where Dooku forged a new identity in the shadows, you can display your new Sith drip to the entire galaxy, but unlike Tyrannus, you will not have to bargain your soul for it. Again guys, 30% off the entire site and 15% more with code WAVE. Now, back to Dooku's transformation. Before the Jedi realized the gentleman they once admired had become something far more dangerous. The location of Dooku's training under Sidious is quite fascinating. Palpatine chose to have Dooku train in an abandoned building in the Works district of Coruscant. The Works was an industrial district that was largely a ghost town. Many corporations in times past had built factories and buildings, but over the eons, it was eventually left to rot. No one really knew who owned what buildings, so all of the skyscrapers just stood abandoned. It was occupied solely by droids and gang activity, and apparently, the Lords of the Sith as well. This was where Dooku underwent his training, right under the Jedi's nose in their own backyard. It's likely that Palpatine chose this location because it was convenient for him to travel to and from training sessions. That way, there were no records of him departing from the planet frequently, and he wouldn't be gone for any suspicious periods of time. Not to mention Coruscant itself was the last place the Jedi would ever look for the Sith. Their eyes would have been on Korriban, Malachor, or any of the other dark side rich worlds in the Outer Rim. Unfortunately for us, information on Dooku's exact curriculum is extremely limited, but from his personal anecdotes from Sidious and Dooku, along with a few stories, we do know a little bit of how it all went down. First things first, Dooku was not trained the way that Maul was. From infancy, Maul was brought up in a secret facility on Mustafar, trained day and night by droids to become an expert in lightsaber combat. He was rarely visited by Sidious personally, and was honed into being nothing more than a weapon. But Dooku was to be used for a far more delicate purpose. For this reason, Sidious trained him as a true Sith apprentice in the Order of the Dark Lords. You see, Sidious trained Maul while he was still apprenticed under Darth Plagueis. The Moon Sith Master had approved of Sidious training Maul only because Palpatine made it explicitly clear that Maul was not really an actual apprentice in the lineage. He was an assassin, which was a very different breed entirely. This wasn't a lie he told to placate his master either. Later, Sidious would admit that Maul was useful, but warriors like him had a limited scope of ability. In the era of the Rule of Two, Maul's skills were best served as a blunt force instrument rather than a successor. Dooku, however, would be trained differently. With Plagueis gone, Dooku truly was Sidious's protege in the Rule of Two, and for this reason, he was much more candid with Dooku about the Sith Grand Plan. Palpatine rarely told Maul anything that didn't have to do with his current mission objective, but Dooku was his closest confidant. This was all a part of Sidious's cunning plan to manipulate the fallen Jedi. He used the naked truth to deceive Dooku into believing that he was much more important than he already was. Sidious knew that Dooku was a very intelligent and a cunning man, and so attempting to hide things with lies and misdirection would simply not work. He had to capture Dooku's mind and his heart. For this reason, Dooku actually held an intense loyalty to his master, and came to sycophantically believe in his wisdom. Because of Sidious's intelligence, Dooku is on record as saying that there was no part of his plan that could be altered to be more perfect. Dooku even says that Sidious's own machinations dwarf the power of the dark side, and Dooku believed that he could not possibly lose. Coming from a Jedi background, he replaced the idea of Yoda in his mind with Sidious. but this blinded Dooku from seeing that he was only being used as a mere tool. When it came to hands-on training, Sidious would skip the basics of Force in combat. The man had 7 decades of Force training under his belt as a Jedi, and Dooku was already considered one of the finest lightsaber duelists of the entire era. Being proficient meant that Sidious could skip straight to deeper lore. All he had to do was indoctrinate the Count with the Sith philosophies, and to get him to embrace the deeper aspects of the dark side. Dooku had so much potential that Sidious was able to spend the next decade teaching him advanced secrets. And yet, when he came out the other side, Tyrannus was nearly as powerful as Grandmaster Yoda. While we don't know any specifics about what exactly he was taught, Dooku reflects that his master had introduced him to, quote, realms of power beyond his most spectacular fantasies. This would include, among other things, Sith sorcery. During the Clone Wars, Dooku displayed a certain level of expertise in Sith magics. He had a deep familiarity with cursed objects, and he dabbled in the creation of doppelgangers. These were effectively clones of himself created from pure darkside energy, each one sharing a fraction of his true power. This allowed the Count to be in several places at once during critical points in the war, directing the web of operations and keeping the Sith scheme alive. But according to both Sidious and Dooku, the Count's training was brief and to the point. There was no fluff nor filler, only practical knowledge to get Tyrannus going. Once a full-fledged Sith Lord, Dooku would explore their histories in his own time. But let's go back to the beginning. When their training began, Sidious was surprised how much Dooku already knew about the Sith. In both canon and Legends continuity, he had been secretly dabbling in their lore for years, studying forbidden holocrons deep in the Jedi archives. In canon, Dooku had even already experienced Force lightning. As a youngling, Dooku unleashed it at a moment of panic when he was kidnapped. The Jedi Masters of the era were both disturbed and impressed, even teaching him a cleansing ritual to purge the dark side and allow him to focus. But later, Dooku would use it again to save the life of a young Qui-Gon Jinn. Dooku had already deciphered so much about the dark side that Sidious found he was actually having to hold back more than he was teaching. Sidious was fearful of Tyrannus growing too powerful too quickly, but Dooku ferociously devoured as much Sith knowledge as possible under his new master's tutelage, and soon enough, he began his own holocron collection that he kept secret and away from his master. During this time, he would also make some personal alterations to his own style and approach to combat and the Force as well. Dooku constructed a brand new lightsaber to better suit his personality as a Dark Lord. Legends continuity states that he would even alter his approach to Form 2 lightsaber combat entirely. For the Jedi, the goal of Form 2 is precision and disarming. Most of the sequences taught to practitioners emphasize the marks of contact known as the Sun Gem, the cutting of the opponent's weapon, or the Cho Mai, the severing of the weapon hand at the wrist. But Dooku would drill himself to adopt different sequences that turned his Makashi into something much more lethal. He would focus on achieving the mark of contact known as the Siak, a precision thrust through the heart. This was the Jedi preferred form of execution since it was quick, clean, and relatively painless. At the time, Dooku was not interested in killing Jedi himself, but it had to happen eventually, and he wanted to make sure that he could do it with great proficiency. But this brings us to the most important aspect of Dooku's training, the erosion of his former self. The main aspect of these formative years was the series of tests that Sidious lined up for the Count. These were to prove his loyalty to the Sith and to solidify his place and standing in the darkness. Palpatine had to use righteous reasoning to show the former Jedi that their goals were in fact aligned. Dooku was first and foremost an idealist, and Sidious wanted to make sure that he corrupted that righteousness before it interfered with Dooku's training, or worse, led him to betray his master. Palpatine convinced him that only through absolute power could peace and justice be restored. Dooku genuinely came to believe that the Sith could bring order where the Jedi could not. In his eyes, the Sith would create peace and justice in the galaxy once they destroyed the rotten, corrupt Republic. And so, despite wanting to impose order, Dooku helped sow chaos by creating the Separatist movement, a total twist and corruption of his true ideals. But Dooku was so deeply indoctrinated, he believed the end result would lead to purity. Sidious nurtured this by the ends justify the means, giving his apprentice reassurance during the early years of their training. When Dooku lamented the death of innocents as a consequence of their schemes, Sidious coldly affirmed that such sacrifices were necessary in the revision of the future. Dooku later writes that he felt a melancholy satisfaction for his role in reshaping the galaxy. But in the Labyrinth of Evil Legends novel, Dooku states the Jedi no longer truly served the Force in his mind. The role had now fallen to the Sith. Dooku believed they were tasked with creating a counterbalance in order to set things right in the Force. And so the true training during the Silent Decade was not so much based in the Force, as it was in ideology and philosophy. Eventually, it was Dooku's belief that the Republic would be replaced by the Galactic Empire with Sidious on the throne, and the Jedi Order would be replaced by a Grand Sith army of which he himself would command as a Dark Grand Master. The Count's prejudice against non-humans was also fulfilled when he believed that humans would dominate in the new empire, and those with the Force would be set above those without it. In the end, the ideas of justice and order became twisted and warped into dreams of Force-based elitist society, one led by an army that did not negotiate but enforced. This was the trickle-down result of all of his moral compromises during his training years under Palpatine. But there was one final lesson that Sidious needed to teach Dooku, one which carried over throughout the entirety of the Clone Wars: deception. Tyrannus marveled at his master's ability to weave intricate and complex plots, ones with so many layers that it would take decades for the Jedi to unravel. He thought he could perhaps win the Clone Wars legitimately with the Separatists, but in the end, Dooku conceded that his master's plan was so perfect that Dooku even admits that it is beyond his own reasoning. Dooku said himself, "How can one defeat an enemy one thinks is a friend?" Unbeknownst to him, this phase was a tragic self-fulfilling prophecy, a lesson he would demonstrate to him when he chose his next apprentice, Darth Vader. And Dooku never saw it coming. This is what we have about the training of Darth Tyranus. Most of the time spent between 32 and 22 BBY, 10 years, was Sidious and Dooku moving their pieces around on the galactic stage rather than intricate Sith tutelage. Dooku was already exceptionally powerful, having a foundation that Maul did not. Much of his Sith training is really low-key and behind the scenes, but in reality before Vader, Dooku is by far the most gifted student that Sidious has ever encountered. Dooku's Jedi foundation was unparalleled. He entered the Sith not as a raw blade to be sharpened like Maul, but as a fully forged weapon already steeped in decades of elite training, philosophy, and mastery. This terrified Sidious far more than he ever admitted. Dooku grew so rapidly in power that Sidious had to be incredibly careful with what secrets he revealed and what knowledge he deliberately held back. Even during the Silent Decade, Dooku may have genuinely rivaled Yoda's power, something that was almost unheard of for a newly forged Sith Lord. The fact that Dooku secretly created his own holocron collection, separate from his master, is equally shocking. No apprentice under the rule of two should ever be that bold, that confident, or that aware of their own potential. This was why Dooku was quietly preparing a future in which he may be able to challenge his master. It may have been the early framework of a plan that could someday overthrow Sidious, but much of this ambition was shaped by idealism. Sidious knew he had to twist Dooku's moral compass so thoroughly that the Count would never again consider returning to the light. Every philosophical lesson, every justification, every shaping of Dooku's worldview was designed to lock him into the Sith path forever. And this is the great irony of their partnership. Palpatine treated Dooku far more like an equal than he ever treated Maul, and in many ways, more than he ever treated Vader. Sidious needed to keep Dooku feeling valued, respected, and included, just long enough to use him. But behind that carefully crafted mentorship, he was preparing to discard him. That alone shows how powerful Dooku really was. If Sidious had ever given him full access to the depths of Sith lore, the way that he did himself, Dooku may have become something more dangerous, perhaps even a legitimate rival to the Dark Lord of the Sith. But instead, he became a perfect instrument, powerful enough to reshape the galaxy, but just limited enough to be broken. So, my fellow students of the Force, what do you think of this? And before the archives close today, a quick reminder, our Star Wars merch page is officially back for the holidays, 30% off site-wide, and code WAVE an extra 15% off your whole order. A far better deal than awaited the Count. Now as for Dooku, his rise is one of the great what-ifs of Sith legend, a master who grew so quickly in power that even Sidious kept his eye open. Brilliant enough to shape a galactic war, but ultimately doomed. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and wherever you may go next, may the Force be with you.